evening and welcome to Avenue Zero. Tonight we journey into the frozen heart of Alaska, where isolation, darkness, and the biting cold hide stories that will freeze your blood. These are 3 true accounts from the most remote corners, tales told by those who lived through the impossible, from emergency responders to seasonal workers and pilots who witnessed the unexplained. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss the true horrors lurking in the world's coldest, most unforgiving places. It's been 3 winters since the night that shattered my belief in what's real and what isn't. My name is Sebastian Cole. For over a decade, I sat behind a dispatch console in the far north, answering desperate voices crying out in the dark. Car wrecks, frostbite, hunters lost in blizzards, cabins gone up in flames. Things that can hollow out your soul if you let them. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the voice that came through the line on the night of February 11th, 2020. It was one of those nights when the cold feels alive, gnawing at the world. The thermometer outside the station read -33, but the wind made it worse. Snow swirled like smoke around the streetlights, and the sky was a lid of iron. Most people with sense had long ago barricaded themselves indoors, tending fires, nursing bottles, or simply enduring the silence. The phones were unusually quiet, a few wellness checks, a drunk threatening to shoot his television because it looked at him wrong, but nothing major. Midnight passed. 1 a.m. dragged itself by. By 2 in the morning, the only sound in the dispatch room was the low hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the building under the weight of ice. And then, my console lit up. Unknown number. Not unusual. People borrowed phones, called from outposts, or even from the old satellite booths scattered across the wilderness, but this call sounded wrong, too clean, too sharp. Not a crackle of static, not the hollow lag of satellite bounce. It was as if the voice on the other end was sitting right beside me. I pressed the line open. "Emergency dispatch. What's your situation?" The voice that answered was low, deliberate. Male. Middle-aged, maybe. The kind of accent you hear from men who'd spent their youth far from here, before drifting north to disappear. "My name is Viktor Sokolov," he said. "I'm calling to report my own death." At first, I thought it was a prank, a drunk, maybe someone on the edge. You get those, especially during the endless winter nights when the sun barely remembers this place exists. But something about the steadiness of his tone made my skin crawl. He wasn't slurring, he wasn't sobbing, he wasn't confused. I asked him to repeat himself. "I'm dead," he said. "I died 3 nights ago, in my cabin, near Raskov Hollow. My body is still there. Someone must come before the wolves find it." Even now, remembering his calm certainty makes my blood run cold. I typed notes into the system, my hands trembling, and tried to keep him on the line. Protocol said, treat it as mental health. Protocol said, keep them talking until help arrived. But protocol had no chapter for a dead man reporting himself. "Viktor," I said, careful not to sound mocking, "can you tell me exactly where you are?" He didn't hesitate. Directions rolled off his tongue. Mile marker 12, then 10 miles into the forest, along an abandoned lumber road, the cabin with a rust-red roof. He even told me the chimney had gone cold 3 days earlier. I checked the database as he spoke, and there it was. His name, his file, 71 years old, retired, lived alone, no family listed, and one more detail that made my chest tighten. A neighbor had already filed a welfare request 2 days earlier. No smoke from Viktor's chimney, no sign of movement. A man who never, ever let his fire die. I told him his neighbor had already been worried, that we were sending someone to check. He answered softly, "They will find me." but they will not find me alive. I asked if he had chest pain, if he was injured, if he had collapsed. He cut me off. I know what happened. I was splitting wood, my chest locked, my breath would not come. I fell face first in the snow. My heart stopped. That was 3 days ago. I saw it happen. His voice, God. His voice was steady, flat, like he was describing the weather. No panic, no tears, just a dead man giving a report. "Victor," I said, "if you're talking to me, you're alive." Silence stretched, then he whispered, "You don't understand. I've been watching my body for 3 days. I gripped the console so hard my knuckles went white. He told me he could see himself, his body lying behind the cabin, face purple, the axe still frozen in his hand. He said the snow around his head was stained darker where he struck the ground. He said ravens had come that morning, plucking at the eyes. I told him officers were on their way, 40 minutes out, battling snow. I begged him to stay on the line. I asked him to describe what he saw around him. He said, "I'm standing in my kitchen, looking through the window. The phone is warm in my hand, but each day I feel less. Yesterday I could feel the cold. Today I cannot. Tomorrow I may not remember how to use the phone. That is why I am calling tonight, before I fade." The officers pushed through the storm. 20 minutes out. 10. I forced myself to keep speaking to him, though my throat was so dry it hurt. I asked if anyone could be nearby. A hunter, a traveler, a trickster. "No," he said. "There is no one for miles. Not in this weather. No one comes to Raskov Hollow in winter. 5 minutes out, officers approaching." I told Viktor help was almost there. He interrupted me. "They will find my body. Tell them I'm sorry for the trouble. I only wanted someone to know. I lived here 30 years. I kept my word to this land. I only ask they treat me with respect." Then, static on the radio. My patrol unit, their voices tense. They'd reached the cabin. No lights, no smoke. Roof rust red against the snow. They approached, then, confirmation. "Dispatch, we have a body. Male, elderly, frozen solid, been dead for days." I looked at my console. The line was still open. The call was still active. "Viktor," I whispered. "Are you there?" Silence. Then, a sound. Not human breathing. Something wetter, something broken, like air forcing its way through a crushed windpipe, rattling, struggling, wrong. And then the line went dead. The officers gave their report. The corpse had been there 3 days. Heart attack while chopping wood, axe frozen in hand. Snow stained dark where his head struck, exactly as he described. But there was no power to the cabin. The generator had been out for a week. And the phone line, disconnected last year after a storm brought the wires down. I checked the logs. The call had lasted 36 minutes. The number that reached me had been out of service for nearly 12 months. That night, I wrote my notes, 40 pages of them. But when I filed the report, I left out the details. Who would believe me? I said an anonymous caller tipped us off. That's all. 6 months later, I transferred to another post. I couldn't take another graveyard shift, waiting for voices that shouldn't exist. But sometimes, when I drive past Raskov Hollow, I think about that night, about the frozen man with the calm voice, about the call that should never have reached me, and I wonder how many other voices drift through the dead lines of this wilderness, how many calls ring through from beyond, asking for help we can never give. And when the phones are quiet, when the snow presses in and the night feels endless, I swear, sometimes I still hear it, that rattling breath, waiting on the other end of the line. The wind howled against my windows like a restless animal, clawing to get inside. It was late, close to midnight, and the snow was still falling in thick sheets across the small Alaskan town where I lived. Nights here had a way of feeling endless. The silence stretched so deep it made every sound, the groan of the floorboards, the ticking of the old wall clock, echo like it was alive. I'd been living alone in that rental cabin for a little over a year. It wasn't much. Just a single-story wooden place on the edge of a forest, the kind of house where the pipes clanked in the cold and the walls let in the draft. But it was mine, and in the silence of the wilderness, it felt like a retreat from the world. That night I was standing in the kitchen, rinsing out a glass, when the quiet broke. The sound was sudden, not a knock, not a tap, but a pounding. My front door shook on its hinges as though someone was determined to break through. The violent rhythm rattled the picture frames on the wall and sent my heart slamming into my ribs. I froze, listening. No one should have been out here. Not at this hour. Not in this storm. The pounding came again, harder this time. I moved toward the window, but the porch light outside was weak, casting more shadow than illumination. Through the blur of frost on the glass, I could barely make out a shape, a figure pacing, shifting, moving too quickly to see clearly. I should have felt afraid, but what I felt instead was irritation. I'm not a small guy. I keep myself in shape, and maybe that gave me more confidence than it should have. Whatever was happening outside, I figured I could handle it, so I opened the front door. Not all the way, just enough to leave the screen latched as a barrier. The figure outside leaned forward. He was a man, maybe mid-60s, with wild hair plastered damp against his forehead. His clothes looked slept in, wrinkled and stained with salt and dirt. His breath steamed in the air as he panted, his chest heaving like he had run for miles. But it was his eyes that stopped me. They darted frantically, never resting, like he was searching for something just out of sight. His jaw clenched and unclenched, and his hands shook as if he were freezing or furious. Before I could ask what he wanted, he barked out words that made my skin crawl. "This is my house." He jabbed a trembling finger toward me, his voice cracking with rage. "You don't belong here. Get out before I call the police." I blinked at him, the cold seeping past the screen door. For a moment, I thought maybe he was lost. Maybe drunk. Maybe in some kind of breakdown. But then, he started saying things. Things he shouldn't have known. He said the master bedroom door banged into the bathroom toilet if you opened it too wide. He said the back door stuck unless you lifted it while turning the knob. He described a loose floorboard in the hall that creaked every time I stepped on it. These weren't things you could guess. These weren't details visible from outside. He knew this house. My tongue felt thick in my mouth. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. I could only stare as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder. Inside were papers, what looked like a lease agreement, with his name printed across the top. He held it up to the glass, his finger tracing the signature line as if daring me to deny it. But that wasn't the worst part. He pulled out his phone. On the screen were photos, dozens of them, him sitting on my couch, him cooking at my stove, him lying in the bed where I slept every night. Some photos had other people in them, strangers smiling at my kitchen table, raising glasses, laughing in the yellow glow of the same overhead light I used every morning. And then came the one that broke something inside me. It was from this past 4th of July. A woman I didn't recognize held the camera, smiling. He was beside her, along with several others, fireworks visible in a box on the counter. But here's the thing. I'd spent the 4th of July right here in this cabin, alone, watching the storm clouds roll in across the mountains. I remember it vividly. So how could this picture exist? I felt my throat tighten, For the first time that night, fear slipped under my skin. My mind spun with impossible explanations. Was he lying? Were the photos doctored, or worse, had I somehow forgotten? Had I shared this house with him? Had I blocked it out? The man's voice rose again, sharp and furious, but all I could do was stand there in stunned silence. Finally, I said I was going to call the police. Not in anger, just desperation. And then, his demeanor changed. His breathing slowed, his eyes stopped darting, and he smiled. "I'll wait outside," he said. Then he turned, walked into the snow, and vanished into the night. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, they brushed it off. They told me he was probably unstable. They didn't even bother looking at my lease. Just advised me to contact my landlord about the house's history. Then they left. But the details haunted me. The photos haunted me. When I reached out to my landlord, he swore he had no idea who the man was. Said he had never rented to anyone matching that description. He gave me the number of the last tenants, an older couple who had lived here for 3 years. They were kind when I called, but they were just as baffled. They had lived alone. They had never heard of him. Still, the memory of his eyes, his voice, his knowledge, it gnawed at me. 2 weeks passed. Nothing happened. My nerves dulled, and I convinced myself it was over. Until the night I came home and found my cabin torn apart, every drawer emptied, every shelf overturned, furniture shoved aside, books scattered across the floor. But nothing was missing. My laptop, my camera, my money, everything valuable was still there. It wasn't a burglary. Someone had been looking for something specific, and whoever it was had a key. The locks weren't broken, the windows weren't forced. I felt a coldness then that had nothing to do with the snow outside. The police took it more seriously this time. So did my landlord. The locks were changed. Security cameras installed. But security can't protect you from questions. How had he known every intimate flaw of the cabin? How had he shown me photographs of a life I never lived? Sometimes, late at night, when the storm winds rattle the windows, I hear the faint echo of that pounding on my door. And in the darkness, I wonder if I'm still living in my own home, or in his. It was supposed to be 6 months of hard work, 6 months of fish, long hours, and rough weather. 6 months of suffering in exchange for enough money to start fresh somewhere else. That's what I told myself when I signed the contract. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I believed the lies. The glossy recruitment flyer I found tacked on a bulletin board in Portland promised adventure in America's last frontier. Housing provided. Excellent pay. Overtime. It didn't mention the island. It didn't mention the silence. It didn't mention the workers who vanished into the night shift and never came back. The company boat took nearly 3 hours to reach the Cannery, a rusted barge slicing through gray waves toward a smudge of land barely visible in the mist. The captain never spoke, his eyes fixed straight ahead, weathered hands tightening around the wheel every time I asked a question. The other passengers, 3 workers returning from leave, drank from a battered bottle without offering me a sip. Every now and then they glanced my way, not with curiosity, not with kindness, with something closer to pity. When the island finally came into view, I understood why. The Cannery squatted at the edge of a natural harbor, a sprawl of corrugated metal buildings, smokestacks belching steam into the wet sky. The air was thick with the sour stench of diesel, fish, and something cloyingly sweet, an odor that curled into the back of my throat and lingered long after I swallowed. The dormitory was a long, narrow structure crammed with bunks, thin mattresses, rusted lockers, fluorescent lights that hummed like insects. My roommate, an older man with hollow eyes, introduced himself as Diego, He'd been here too many seasons and said he came back only for the money. But before I could ask more, the dinner bell rang. An electric buzzer that made my skin crawl. The mess hall was worse than a prison cafeteria. Gray trays, overcooked food, workers eating in silence. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like they were half asleep. Or half alive. I tried to ask Diego how many people worked here. He only nodded toward a corner table where 6 men sat with their heads bowed, clothes stained dark. "They're the night shift," Diego whispered. "Processing Unit D, don't talk to them." When one of the men lifted his head, I saw the whites of his eyes were streaked red, as if he hadn't slept in years. Work began at 4 a.m. The gutting line was endless. Conveyor belts squealing, blades flashing, workers bent over carcasses as the machines devoured them one after another. The smell was unbearable. Not just fish, not just disinfectant. There was that same sweetness again, the smell that reminded me of fruit left too long in the sun, of something rotting beneath the sugar. After 3 days, my hands were raw despite the gloves. My back ached. My mind buzzed with the rhythm of the line. But the others, they barely seemed human. They worked in perfect synchronization, never missing a beat. Their faces blank, their eyes glazed. I whispered to Diego during break, "How long have some of these people been here?" He looked across the floor at a man they called Alvarez. 4 years on the line, he said. I watched Alvarez carefully. His movements were flawless. No hesitation, no mistakes. He never stretched his arms, never paused, never even blinked. It was like watching a puppet pulled by invisible strings. On my 10th day, I was summoned to Processing Unit D, the night shift, the place Diego had warned me about. The building was different from the others, newer, cleaner, humming with fluorescent light that made the skin on my arms crawl. The supervisor, a woman in a white coat who introduced herself only as Dr. Hale, explained that they were testing a new preservation method, something that would extend the shelf life of fish indefinitely. We wore protective gear. The fish were injected with a clear solution from stainless steel tanks. Within minutes, their color faded from silver to ghostly white. Their flesh stiffened, glistening with an oily sheen. Dr. Hale assured us this was normal. But the fish didn't look dead. They looked paused. One night, while working alone in storage, I found containers marked with dates years old. 2019, 2018, 2016. I opened one. Inside, the fish looked freshly caught. Perfect. No decay, no smell. But when I lifted one, it was warm. Not the warmth of the room, the warmth of skin and the gills. They moved. A slow, shallow flutter, like a breath. I dropped it and stumbled back. And that's when I realized every container in the room was trembling, fish shifting against each other as if they were restless, as if they were waiting. Dr. Hale found me staring. Her voice was calm, steady. "You shouldn't be back here without clearance." I demanded to know what the solution was. She smiled faintly. "It preserves more than flesh. It preserves function. It preserves possibility." Then she leaned closer. "You're adapting faster than most. Mr. Carter will want to speak with you about a permanent role here." The manager's office smelled of smoke and leather. Carter, thin and sharp-eyed, leaned across his desk. He told me the Cannery was a cover, a research facility, a testing ground for compounds designed to keep food and eventually people viable indefinitely. "Do you understand?" he asked. I asked what would happen if I refused. His smile never reached his eyes. No one refuses. Not once they've begun. That night I tried to escape. I made it as far as the dock before 2 men pulled me back. They weren't angry, just firm. Their faces were expressionless, their grip cold. Back in the dorm, Diego sat waiting. "I warned you," he said softly. "What are they doing to us?" I whispered. He held out his hand. "Look." My own hands, blistered and raw days ago, were healed, smooth, stronger than before. "They've been feeding it to us," Diego said. "Small doses at first, just enough to make us work longer, heal faster, then more, until you can't live without it." I shook my head. "That's impossible." "Is it?" He leaned forward. "When was the last time you felt tired?" Weeks blurred. The compound crept deeper into my veins. I needed less sleep, less food. I forgot what day it was, what month. The line no longer felt exhausting. It felt natural. And the voices in my head, the ones that used to scream, get out," grew quiet. One night, I found Diego scribbling notes, his hands trembling. He looked up at me with eyes already glazed. "Write it down," he begged, "before you forget. Before you stop caring." His handwriting was jagged, then mechanical, then almost uniform. The last thing he wrote before he vanished into processing unit D was, "This is not work. This is preservation. And preservation is just another word for forever." I lasted 23 weeks before I stopped writing. By then, I understood. We weren't employees anymore. We weren't even human. We were specimens. The official records say I signed a permanent contract, that I've been here 5 years now, that I never miss a shift, never call home, never age. But records don't matter. What matters is this. If you're ever offered a job at a remote cannery, one that makes you sign pages of confidentiality agreements, one where the pay sounds too good to be true, don't take it. Because some jobs don't just change your life, they erase it. And preservation means you never leave.